welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I am Oles Garjuk with UATV. Crimea has once again turned out to be in the middle of another controversial discussion as the occupational authorities passed the regional law allowing peninsular citizens and companies to write off the debts to Ukrainian banks. Specifically, individuals and enterprises were granted permission to dodge the loans of up to 5 million rubles, which is roughly almost 85,000 US dollars in Ukrainian banks. To many experts, the new legislation seems like a gross violation of the international law. To have a more detailed conversation on the issue, we are joined in the studio today by Anton Korynevych. He is an expert in international law. Hello, and thank you for coming.
Good evening.
So I would like to ask, how legitimate is so-called Crimean authorities' decision to forgive the debts of Crimean citizens and companies to Ukrainian banks?
I think that the best answer to this question would be that this decision is totally illegitimate, both under international law and under the national law of Ukraine. First of all, Russia as the occupying power doesn't have the right to make such decisions on the occupied territory. So we have a concrete list of rules which lists the rights and obligations of the occupying power, considering the civilian population and occupied territories as a whole. So occupying power doesn't have the right to make any decisions, to adopt any laws which are, in this sense, discussing the banking issues and the issues of credits and debts of the civilian population on the occupied territories. This is the first issue, so the occupying power doesn't have such right. The other issue, which is also important, is that the so-called Supreme Council of the Republic of Crimea is totally illegitimate under international law, and it doesn't have any right to adopt any laws, any regulations, any decisions, and these decisions are not deemed as binding by international law.
So what Ukrainian government reaction should be?
Well, I think that the reaction might be the official announcement by the, let's say, National Bank or any other authority which deals with banking and financial issues, that Ukraine doesn't recognize this decision of the Supreme Council of the so-called Republic of Crimea, because this organ is totally illegitimate and the occupying power doesn't have these rights. But on the other hand, we need to see whether Ukrainian authorities need to make such an announcement, whether Ukrainian banks suffer because of this decision, whether Ukrainian banks still have some interests in Crimea, whether they still have these debts or credits.
Do they have an interest in these debts or credits?
Well, we might not know this for sure here in Kiev, but the issue is that some news agencies state that and provide us information that Russian collectors bought a lot of Ukrainian debts and credits, and that if this is true, then Ukrainian banks do not have any interest no more. But still, I think that national authorities which deal with banking or financial issues have more information. And if these interests of Ukrainian banks suffer, then Ukrainian financial authorities, I think, might do the official statement or announcement.
Could any international justice institutions influence maybe this situation somehow?
Well, in general, of course, Ukrainian banks and other Ukrainian legal entities who suffered in Crimea, who had damages in Crimea, they may bring claims to international arbitration tribunals if their interests suffer. Again, here in this situation, if Ukrainian banks still have any credits and debts there in Crimea. So they can address international arbitration tribunals. But the question is, even if the decision will be in favor of Ukrainian legal entity, whether the Russian Federation will make decision to enact this decision of the international tribunal, whether they will fulfill it, or they will just do nothing and will just proclaim that this decision is illegal and they will not make it enforceable. So this might also be an issue.
So basically, if Ukrainian banks sold these debts to the Russian collector companies, it means that Russia suffers the loss the most, like these Russian collector companies.
It looks like in this case, Russian collectors or any other Russian, either natural persons or legal entities, suffer a lot because they possess these debts, and they now will need to behave in accordance with the decision of the Supreme Council, so-called Supreme Council of Crimea, because they recognize it as a legitimate body. So
that's very interesting. But actually, even the procedure itself of writing off these debts is not clear, because it should involve the Depositors Protection Fund. And what kind of organization is that?
Well, I think that we here might talk about the Depository Protection Fund, which are created in almost any country, for instance in Ukraine also, who oversee how the debts and credits are done. And if the banks, for instance, collapse, then they make the payments to the natural persons who gave their money to the banks. So this organization, I think, are created in a lot of countries in the world. So we may see in future how this depository fund in Crimea, the Russian-controlled one, of course, how they will deal with this issue, how they will deal, which credits will automatically be written off, which maybe will be with some procedure. But again, under Ukrainian national law, as under international law, all these decisions regarding Crimea are totally illegitimate, illegal, null and void, because Crimea is territory of Ukraine, and only Ukrainian legislation and only Ukrainian national laws and other legal acts shall be working there.
If the Ukrainian banks still have some interest in some of the debts in Crimea, how do you think, how intense would be Ukrainian banking system loss in this case?
Well, I think that if they still have these interests, there will be not so many cases of this interest. So I think that banks are not stupid. They see this situation in Crimea for 3 years. So they may have sold all these debts really. But if they still have some, these are not the big money for banks. These are not, let's say, money for high industry or whatever. So I think the loss will not be intense. But again, we should see in each particular case, on a case-by-case basis, which bank, which debts, which number, and then what they can do in this case. But again, Crimea is a totally illegal space, is a totally gray or dark zone, right, where law will not be the regulator of relations, neither international law, unfortunately, nor Ukrainian law.
Okay, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
This was Anton Korynevych, an expert in international law, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.